Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event this evening, the online launch of Peggy Nash's new book, Women Winning Office, an Activist's Guide to Getting Elected. My name is Devin, and I'm from Between the Lines, which is the publisher of this great book. We're a social movement press founded in 1977, and we aim to publish books that reflect our activist roots and our commitment to social justice struggles. So when Peggy came to us with her manuscript, we were thrilled and delighted to publish it. Our press is situated in Toronto, traditional Wendat, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee territory, subject to the dish with one spoon wampum. This land was stewarded by the Mississauga of the Credit River and is home to many Indigenous peoples, including the Métis, and those displaced from their homelands by Canadian extractive and other industries. So together we share in a responsibility to care for and nurture these lands and to struggle for a better future for the earth and all peoples. So I invite everyone who's joining us here today to reflect upon their relationship to the territories upon which they join us from, and to think about your relationship to Indigenous struggles for self-determination. So our event tonight is being sponsored by a number of organizations, and we're thrilled to be in partnership with them, one of which is the Broadbent Institute, as well as the Canadian Labour Congress, and a few incredible independent bookstores. One is Another Story in Toronto, Octopus Books in Ottawa, McNally Robinson in Winnipeg, and Spartacus Books in Vancouver. And I encourage all attending and watching this event after the fact that if you haven't got your copy of Peggy's book, please, talk to your independent local bookstore and support them and all the important work that they do in carrying these books. I'll also just remind our audience that we are going to be accepting audience questions, and you can use the Q&A function of the chat or of the Zoom room, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, I'll introduce our moderator for this evening, who will then introduce the speakers and get us started with the discussion. So our moderator is Fatima Syed, a Mississauga-based journalist. She works as an Ontario reporter for the Narwhal and is the host of the Backbench podcast on the Canada Land Network. She is a National Magazine Award nominee and a Digital Publishing Award winner, and just won recently the 2022 WordPress Freedom Award. So congratulations on that. And she is also the Vice President of the Canadian Association of Journalists. So thanks for joining us, Fatima, and take it away.
Thanks, Devin, and hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm joining you from Mississauga in Ontario, and I'm really excited to be here with three badass female politicians. I can say badass at this event, right? So I'm going to introduce them, and then we'll get straight into the discussion. Joining us today is Leah Gazan. She's a member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre. She's currently the NDP critic for children, families, and social development, as well as the critic for women and gender equality. Leah has been a champion in the fight for a permanent guaranteed livable basic income in Canada, and earlier this year introduced Bill C-223, the National Framework for a Guaranteed Livable Basic Income Act. She was a prominent Winnipeg lead during Idle No More and co-founded the We Care campaign aimed at building public will to end violence against Indigenous women and girls. Leah is a member of the Wood Mountain Lakota Nation located in Saskatchewan Treaty 4 territory. Welcome, Leah. We've also got Andrea Reimer. She was elected as the Vancouver City Councilor in 2008 while co-chairing Gregor Robertson's successful campaign for mayor. She served 3 terms, spearheading efforts to make Vancouver the greenest city on earth and creating its municipal framework for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Previously, she was elected to the Vancouver School Board, a first for the Green Party in Canada. Andrea is now an adjunct professor of practice at the University of British Columbia School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. In addition to her public roles, Andrea has served on the board of the Canadian Women Voters Congress, ran a small business, worked in service, retail, and manufacturing, and survived as a street-involved youth. She is the recipient of the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Award, the World Green Building Council Chairman's Award, and the Loeb Fellowship at Harvard University. Hi, Andrea. Thanks for being here. And finally, Peggy Nash, the reason we're all here, author of Women Winning Office. She's an advocate for labor rights and social justice in Canadian politics and the labor movement. As a longtime senior negotiator for the CAW, now Unifor, a former president of the federal New Democratic Party, she was a candidate for leader after the untimely death of Jack Layton, a candidate in several federal elections. She served as a member of parliament and was named official opposition industry and finance critic. Peggy is an educator, a frequent media commentator, a founding member of Equal Voice, and a co-founder of Toronto Metropolitan University's Women in the House program. Hi, Peggy.
Hi.
Suffice to say, these three women are badass based on those bios alone. I'm going to get straight into the conversation. A reminder to anyone listening, please feel free to dump your questions in the Q&A box. I will be looking, and I promise to get to them at the end of the conversation. But first, I thought it would be nice to start with a passage, a very, very short passage from Peggy's book that really got me thinking. This is actually towards the end of the book, and Peggy writes, and I'm quoting now, "Progressive legislative changes and outcomes are essential, whether on racial justice, Indigenous rights, workers' rights, environmental sustainability, reducing inequality, economic justice, whatever it is. Those of us who get into elected life to do something, as opposed to wanting to be something, want to see real outcomes. How we achieve change must also be a priority. Welcoming diversity into governments and then leaving people to fail or exit in frustration sets us back. So while the what is important, the why, the how are also vital." I want to complicate matters and ask a spicy first question, which is, who is to blame for the lack of women in politics? Peggy, why don't you go first?
Sure. I think it depends on the level of government, but I will speak to provincial, federal, and territorial governments. And I think at that level, I would say mainly political parties, because if and when political parties make the decision that they want a majority of their candidates to be women or people who identify as women, if they want a large number of Black, racialized, Indigenous, queer candidates, they can do that through going out and recruiting possible candidates long before an election. I think municipal politics is a little bit different. Parties don't always operate in the same way. You might have coalitions or movements, but not official parties. But I think there is a similar recruiting process. And, there's this vision, a stereotypic old vision of who is electable and what a traditional politician looks like. I think the three of us broke those molds in our own way. I think there's lots of women getting elected now who are breaking those molds, but we need to do much better. And just getting women elected is not the whole story. You have to support them and help them to succeed so that they don't end up getting discouraged and then leaving in frustration. So I think political parties can play the biggest role here.
Leah, do you agree? Are parties holding back increasing gender diversity of Canadian politics?
Well, I think that's certainly one factor. I mean, it's, one thing to recruit people, but it's another thing to run people in winnable ridings. Not all ridings are winnable. We know that women are most often run in ridings that aren't winnable. Certainly, I do think political parties do play a role, but I also think it's the institution itself. I think it's no secret that, the House of Commons is like the eye of the colonial storm. And, when you're breaking down those walls, particularly as an Indigenous person, we have a long way to go, riddled with misogyny, lots of racism still, and still rooted in colonial values that were designed to exclude and, certainly exclude to the point of places where we know the Indian Act was established and put into policy. And, Indigenous people, again, weren't even part of the system, couldn't even participate in the system until 1960, never mind women. So I think it's one thing to have people in there. It's another thing to have people go in there and make sure it's safe and make sure that people have actual place, and that it's one thing to be a face, but then if you're going to have diversity, then you have to open up the door for diverse perspectives. That's the point of having diversity. And certainly being elected for the last 3 years, it's been a journey. It's the greatest honor of my life, but it is a struggle, and I'll keep kicking down the walls. I'll keep kicking down those walls to make it easier for the next one after me. I just want to give a shout out to Brian. He's from Winnipeg Center. He's on here tonight. I'm homesick. I'm going home next week, and just want to give a special shout out to Brian.
Hi, Brian. Thanks for being here. Andrea, who do you blame for the lack of women in Canadian politics?
Oh, I think there's a whole host of people. When I was elected to local government, I did a lot of work around gender inclusion, but also particularly the inclusion of women and girls. I remember particularly around a sporting event, we had the FIFA Women's World Cup, and people were asked, saying at the time it was around pay equity and turf versus grass. These are, sorry, I feel like I've already dove into the literal weeds here, but the issues were the media would ask me about it. And I'm like, why do you think it's any easier for women in sports than in politics or journalism for that matter? Right. So it's not that women in politics face anything worse than women in journalism. We could spill some tea on that, I'm sure, Fatima, and in other aspects of life. But in politics, it's public, right? So you're in this fishbowl and people are watching you. And so it becomes latent and obvious in ways that I'm not sure it is so much in other areas. And then there's the integrity of it, right? We're talking about representation, who is sitting at the table making the laws to make more room for all of us. And if their names are Stephen, Paul, and Tim, do the four of us really feel like they're closely paying attention to the issues that might be barriers for us out in the world outside of politics? So I think all of us bear some responsibility in it, and the systemic barriers are the ones that I think are both the most latent and the hardest ones to get into. I think about, I've done a lot of recruiting. I used to work in the back rooms of the Green Party, so recruited a lot of candidates to run for office. It ended up running myself because at some point you lack personal integrity if you've asked several hundred people to run and someone asks you to run and you're like, oh no, I could never do that. But I'm so struck by women don't get the resume to run for office because people don't they don't get asked to sit on boards. They don't get asked to be the treasurer. Or they do a ton of volunteer work with no title attached to it. So then because they don't have the resume, it's a barrier to them running for office. And it becomes this kind of treadmill. I've seen a lot more women getting brought in on boards, for example. It stands out if your board is 2 women and 10 men these days. But I was just in a board meeting yesterday where we spent 2 hours talking about EDI. And then right after that, appointed people to 2 committees. One was finance related, one was social justice issues related. The finance one was 75% men, and the social justice one was 100% women, right? And so it's that kind of systemic bias that creates ultimately barriers for women to develop the resumes and connections and networks that they need to successfully fight the societal barriers that they're going to face outside of these organizations when they're running in an election in their community.
You've all sort of identified certain barriers, and I wondered if I could prod each of you to share an example of a struggle with a barrier to entry to politics that you had to face when you were running for office or even thinking about running for office. Peggy?
I come from a working class background, and shout out to my Unifor friends who are watching tonight. And, you think of politics and people who get elected. as the professional class, as the lawyers and the business owners and people that our family wasn't. And so I think not really seeing enough role models of working people, or knowing role models who were working people who got elected, and then internalizing a lot of self-doubt that, well, who am I? Could I ever run for office? I don't know that I have the qualifications. And now I look back on that thinking, and I if I was recruiting me at the time, I would say, are you crazy? You've done all these things. And if I recruit someone else, say from the labor movement, or a community leader, you know, those are impressive credentials that really help train you for politics, because it's about connecting with people, organizing people. And I can speak for the labor movement. You learn so many skills in terms of negotiation, chairing meetings, public speaking, how things get passed. Maybe it's motions or decisions of various kinds, but Parliament isn't that dissimilar. And I think what was the biggest barrier for me was self-doubt. And I think similarly to Andrea, I had done a lot of women's leadership training, especially in my union. And I kept encouraging women to run for leadership positions in the union, and also to run for elected office. And then people said to me, well, why don't you do it? And so I really had to kind of put up or shut up. Yeah. And why shouldn't I do it? And it was not something I ever thought I would do in my life. It was frightening. I remember saying to a friend when I decided to run, it was like I had just jumped off a cliff, and because I didn't know the process well enough. I didn't know how you become a nominated candidate, what the steps were. So it's that sense of being an outsider and not knowing how things work that for me was the biggest barrier. But one of the women I interviewed in the book, Alejandra Bravo, said, you know, those struggles that you have, whether it's as a working person or whether it's as a newcomer or as a Black or Indigenous person, those struggles are what give you your power, because it's those struggles that really give you the energy and the motivation and the why to get involved in politics. So for me, it was really fighting for workers' rights and social justice in my union that finally helped me decide that even though it was frightening, I needed to step up.
Mm-hmm. Leah, do you agree that often it might be women holding the gender diversity of Canadian politics from improving?
Well, I think, I think there's gender diversity, but I think there's intersectionalities within that. And, it's one thing being a woman in that place, which is difficult. I mean, I joke and I call the House of Commons the dude's den. Oh, going back into the dude's den, because it really, I was sitting in the House one day and they were debating a motion about concerns they had about, the white males in academia, losing the best and the brightest from affirmative action policies to ensure diversity. They were debating this in the House, and I was laughing hysterically, and I had to remove myself. As a former academic, I knew one thing we don't have to fight for is keeping white males in power. This is not a global crisis here. But being a woman in there is hard. Being an Indigenous woman is really hard because, of course, not only do you have to deal with all the misogyny and sexism of that place and the mansplaining, it's a profession in politics, but you're also constantly dealing with racism, stereotypes and stigmatization where people want to see you a certain way. Particularly somebody like me who is a longtime advocate. I've been on the front lines of a lot of movements, climate justice movements, fighting to see an end to violence against Indigenous women and girls. Human rights matters, whether it's here on Canadian soil or internationally. And so you're radicalized. The fact that you stand up for your human rights that most Canadians are afforded, Indigenous people are not, you go in that place and you're radicalized. So it's been a journey for me. I've been there for 3 years. I've made a point of staying true to my values because, if I'm not there representing my values, fighting for the human rights of all people, including Indigenous people, Palestinian people, fighting for the human rights, who's gonna be, what are they gonna be fighting for in there, and who's gonna take that seat? So it's difficult. I'm not gonna say it's not. We've heard lots of stories, but it's difficult, but it's a privilege at the same time, because I do feel, even though it's hard, it is very hard, that I am making a difference, that I'm impacting discussions, that I might be impacting the way people see the world. Even in committees, I'm in the Status of Women Committee with all these different, with women, all women from different political parties. And we actually have really good critical discussions about the world and ideas. And I think that matters. So it's difficult, but do feel that, representation does matter.
Andrea, jump in here. Can you what sort of barriers to entry did you personally face when you were running or thinking about running?
Yeah, well, I don't know that it reflects super well on me to disclose this, but it's not the first time I've disclosed it, but maybe the one most directly related to politics. I kind of ran, not entirely by accident, but I definitely won by accident. So I think if someone would have told me I had a chance of winning, or if I would have understood that, I really can't imagine that I would ever have run. I was 29. I had a 4-year-old at home. I had just started a new job, running the largest membership-based environmental organization in Canada. So obviously wasn't looking for another job on top of that. But I think most critically, I was a woman, ambiguous ethnic identity. Turns out I'm adopted. So, I just, people always ask me, where am I from? It turns out I'm Indigenous, but I did not know that at the time. I'd been street involved, a drug user, sex worker, heavily involved in advocacy. And here's the capper, I was running with the Green Party in 2002. So the chances of me winning seemed, pretty impossible. But I was trying to prove a point to the party at the time, which was I'd run the 2001 election campaign because, I believe strongly in the values and the policies of the party of the day. And I saw my role as working behind the scenes. I was a community organizer. That's where I felt like I could have the most effort. The party at the time, and I think still in some places, was opposed to knocking on doors because it felt that it was invasive in people's lives. And I was like, you can't win if you don't make eye contact and talk to people. Like, that's where you win hearts and minds. Anyway, so we knocked on 20,000 doors. And the point was to say we could do better that way than we would if we didn't knock on doors. And we did do better. We won. It was a squeaker. We were, we have an at-large voting system in Vancouver. So that means there's no electoral districts. So everyone in the city can vote for you or against you. So of 150,000 votes cast in that election, I won the last place on the slate that's elected by, I think it was 50 votes. It's like 0.002% or something. I was way behind on the 12th. I was in 12th place on the last reporting poll, was still to go, and ordered another beer. I was exhausted. Anyone's exhausted at the end of an election campaign. So perhaps getting a little tipsy. And I jumped from 12th up to 9th. It was the university was the last reporting poll. And they loved the 29-year-old Green Party candidate of ambiguous ethnic origin. So anyway, the point is, don't order the beer before the ballots are counted. And also it, launched me into a world. I don't know. I think a lot of what Leah says really resonates with me. Like, it was definitely an alien environment, even the little school board. I mean, council was another jump again for me, but we're talking a lot about the barriers to getting elected, but the barriers to being elected, like once you cross that and being effective elected, are equally challenging. I wanted to pick up on a couple things Leah said around that. It's around that issue of, well, I mean, something we haven't named yet. There's a big difference between women and feminists. So this idea that electing women is electing feminists is not, and it took me quite a bit of time to figure that out. I chaired the Women's Campaign School and, didn't totally understand that while it's a great virtue to want to be multi-partisan, the reality is you're electing people that are just as hostile to feminism as men of your own party might be. So there was a point where I was on city council and there were 5 women elected and 5 feminists. Those were not the same people, right? So I think that's something we really have to think about. The other thing, we now have 8 women elected on city council, but they're all white. And they bring, I mean, a perspective that is not as inclusive of a council that had less women on it, in terms of understanding intersectional feminism. And so it's not so simple, right? It's quite a complex issue once you start diving into it.
Well, this leads me nicely into my next question. And I apologize, but I am going to push back a little bit on all 3 of you, because I am the journalist and you're all politicians or former politicians. But this is not a new conversation, right? We've been talking about, improving diversity, both gender and racial diversity in Canadian politics across all levels for a very, very long time. Why are parties struggling to do this? Because even, for example, if we look at the NDP, they've historically nominated a lot of women, but they're mostly white. And the result, the number of those nominated women that get elected is far fewer than the original number. I look at the Green Party and see the same problem. Here in Ontario, Diane Sachs, who on paper is an incredible candidate, but was running in a riding where she struggled to win. And I wonder why parties haven't figured this out yet. Like, what's holding them back?
Well, why don't I jump in just to start? I think that what all parties have done at one point or another is nominated or got women nominated in ridings to say that they had women running. And they were dead dog ridings for them. They were ridings where they could never, ever get elected, but they could say, oh, well, we've got all these women candidates. And they have been justifiably criticized for that. I think you have to look at outcomes. I mean, we just had an election here in Ontario, and I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but the NDP caucus, although they lost 8 seats, I think their caucus is about 60% women. They elected a number of Black and racialized women. And I mean, you can always do better, but I think that ensuring that you not only recruit candidates, but yes, intersectional feminists in ridings where they have a shot at winning. If you're in the NDP, for example, there's never a guaranteed winnable seat. It would be interesting to know where those are, but certainly I'm from Toronto, and in Toronto, every riding is a tough fight, and you have to organize like a demon and really get a lot of volunteers and work really hard. But I mean, we've re-elected some women like Laura May Lindo and Dr. Jill Andrew, and Jill is in a seat that was always a Liberal seat, and she has held that seat. So I think the days of just nominating women and letting them sink or swim have to be over. There has to be a real effort to support them and to supporting them once they get elected, because we've also seen the situation, and we saw that in Ontario where candidates got elected and then they either didn't run again because they just felt that the institutional challenges were just too great, they within the party and within the legislature, or they just didn't get the support they needed. And when it came to running again for the nomination, were not successful. So I think you can't just say, hey, run for us, and it's sink or swim, and you're totally left up to your own devices. I'll just say one thing. When I first got elected, we were in a tiny little caucus, and you think, oh, people are going to come around you and they're going to support you and help you learn how you become a member of parliament, because it is very intimidating. But we were too small to be able to do that. And it's quite overwhelming. All of the, who knew what standing orders were and the orders of the day. And it was very confusing. And a couple of women colleagues, especially Alexa McDonough, really spent the time to help me succeed. I don't think I would have without that.
Leah, Andrea, I'll let you jump in, but I do have the stats for Ontario's election. I'm using that because it's the most recent election we saw in Canada. Equal Voice said that in terms of candidates, the Ontario NDP, Ontario Liberals, and Green Party of Ontario were close to gender parity in their nominations, and the Ontario PC party had 26% female candidates. But when we look at the makeup of who was elected, only 39% of the legislature, as it is right now, is women. So what is
because of those conservatives? Because of those conservatives.
Well, I guess, what's the struggle?
Yeah, I mean, partly, and I'm not going to claim to be an expert on Ontario provincial politics, but I am, I've spent a fair amount of time around organizations and am a woman in politics, so I know the stats pretty well. It would surprise me if we looked at the stats around the Greens and Liberals and NDP. Like, I don't think any of those three parties were planning on winning an election. So it's very safe for them to bring women in, put them on the ballot, point to those numbers, knowing full well that most of them, well, I don't even think knowing full well captures it, like not even stopping to think about the impact on all those women of using them as basically a backdrop or a virtue signal about whether those women will run again now that they've lost, right? In an election where they have a lot more chance to win. And that's the nature of politics. I mean, the one word answer to your question, Fatima, is power. I mean, politics, like many things in life, is about power. And women tend to be kept out of it. That men have controlled the powerful offices for many, many, many decades. And while women, we've had some amazing allies, and I really do want to emphasize, like, if you ask me what one of the solutions is, it's male allies. If it's just women sitting talking to women, it gives us the support we need to go fight another battle. But imagine if we didn't need support to go fight battles and could just go do good representative work on behalf of Canadians or Vancouverites or Ontarians or whoever we're representing. So I think that is really the crux of it. How many times have I heard, I can speak to my own experience. I was, it's funny, I teach about power in part because of this issue. I think we have to up our power literacy game, but I still have trouble saying this out loud, that I probably was the most powerful woman in Vancouver politics in the last 15 years. I was deputy mayor. I had a strong year as the mayor. I got a lot of things done for a variety of reasons. I'm certainly not alone, like it's a community effort, but I can't imagine a scenario where I would have a shot at winning for mayor. And largely because there's a lot of men who think that that is their place. And there's a public that sees men as leaders, right? So I'm fighting two battles. I'm fighting within my own movement, where I'm told that a mediocre man is better than a very well-qualified woman by virtue of his gender. And I'm fighting the public who reinforces that belief in the choices that they're making, right? look at the premiers across the country, the day one of them says that they're stepping down to make room for a woman or a person of color will be the day that I really believe that things are starting to shift.
Leah, jump in here. Do we need like a major culture shift then to see, a more representative Canadian political system? And if so, how do we, speed that along? How do we get it done faster?
Well, just building on what Andrea and Peggy said, I mean, I think it very much is about power. And the only way you change structures is if people are willing to give up power, privilege, and control. All of the control and power in politics, even if you look at, upper echelon, party establishment, it looks pretty uniform across all parties, in fact, and people have to be willing to step aside. I think the scary part about giving up that power, privilege, and control to empower people who have, either been left out or marginalized in these systems is people don't know what that will look like. And when you have people that go in those systems that start questioning the status quo, start questioning the way things are, the way things are supposed to work, and even values. I find this particularly on the left. My father was a CCFer. I grew up on the left. But we want to see ourselves as good. We want to see ourselves as fighting change. But when you have people questioning what that looks like, when you say, I don't want you to be my voice, I want you to be my ally. I don't need you fighting for me, I need you fighting with me. Then you start pushing back on control, and you start pushing back on who controls the narrative for who. And I think those are difficult discussions in politics for all parties. I think, not to plug my own party, I think the NDP, and certainly in my caucus, I think we do a really good job having those difficult discussions. We do a really good job, trying to figure out how to make sure that people have space around the table. But that's difficult. Those kinds of changes within structures and party systems are not easy, but they are possible. And I agree, people are more likely to join a party if they see themselves in it. And when I was growing up, one of the reasons that I felt so comfortable going to functions with my parents, who were, they were an interracial couple at a time when there was no interracial marriages. They reflected diversity, religious diversity, spiritual diversity. That was my parents. Was because when I would go to functions, I felt like I had place. I could see people that looked like me. We need to ensure that we have diversity in the circles. And when we see that diversity waning, then we have to question what we're doing. And so I think we constantly have to push back, but I think these systems are really hard to change.
I know Andrea wants to jump in.
Yeah, well, I had just a quick follow-up and to speak, to follow up a bit on Leah's comments that I saw this, I don't know, this is back in the days before streaming, and it was like on a channel and you had to watch what was on channels when things were on channels because it was the only thing on. It was a documentary about women in politics, and they had the former Norwegian Prime Minister Gro Brundtland on. She's like Prime Minister back in the early 80s, so quite a while back. And she was talking about how a young boy, a boy below 10 years old, had asked his mother in front, had met her and asked his mother in front of her, Mom, can a man ever be prime minister? And it so much struck with me, like, we're not talking about needing decades to change this. We're talking about a relatively short timeline. Like, if women are in leadership positions and seen to be in leadership, who and how they inspire people starts to grow. And I think that's what Peggy was well, I don't want to speak for Peggy. I think it's one of the values of Peggy's book is that it allows people who have been in those leadership positions, we can hear their voices in the book, as well as have this incredibly practical, so not just hear about and see leadership models, but see the steps that it takes to get there, which turned out not to be that frightening, right? They're actually pretty straightforward once you get through that power veil and on the, like, seeing yourself on the other side of it.
It's interesting because, as you all have sort of indicated throughout this conversation, it's a holistic problem that isn't just that doesn't just exist on election day, right? Like in the past several years, we've seen really strong, inspiring female politicians leave Canadian politics. I'm thinking of Momolak specifically. We've also seen just the amount of unfair and vitriol female politicians face, everyone from Catherine McKenna to Michelle Rempel. And then we're seeing the struggle of female leaders to stay in leadership positions in the party. I'm thinking of Andrea Horwath at the Ontario NDP who just resigned, or Kathleen Wynne, also Ontario Liberals, who had to resign after just the sheer amount of hate they both get. And I know all of you on this panel have faced various struggles in that regard. So if we succeed in bringing women into the political system, how do we help them stay there? Like, what are the concrete steps we need to do to support them, which is something you've all addressed in this conversation too?
Well, I think that's also, it's complex, and I do just want to quickly pick up on a point Andrea raised about, who we see as leaders, and it does have to do with power. And I think that parties can have women leaders when it doesn't look like the party is going to be in government. But as soon as it looks like there's a chance at getting power, the field gets very crowded and women tend to get squeezed out. And I remember vividly after Jack Layton's death, it was a crowded field to replace him because we were official opposition. And there was the thinking that maybe we could make government in the next election. And I was told that, we tried a woman, this isn't the time for a woman, as though you get one crack at it. I mean, we'd actually had a couple of women leaders, but you see that in the current leadership at the provinces and territories today. And you also see that in that it's rare, and I think maybe never have we re-elected a woman premier. So these are difficult positions, and I think the leader is just a symptom, if you will, of the situation of others in politics. And it's like the media as well. And someone else mentioned sports. I think Andrea mentioned sports, where if you stick your head above the parapet, there's always a lot of people waiting to shoot at you. And how dare you assume that power? And so I talk about this a lot in my book, where candidates have faced racism, sexism, Islamophobia, homophobia. And, it's partly, I think, the way you deal with it is anticipating it. So to expect that you're going to sail through and there won't be this kind of attack, I think is unrealistic, but some face it much more than others. So I think preparing your team for it, and having a number of options for how you're going to deal with it. So for me, and I was elected before really the intensity of social media attacks that there is today. But the way we dealt with it, I would send out messages on social media, but I didn't spend a lot of time reading social media or engaging with it. My team would do that so that I didn't have to kind of ingest the negativity, because I just felt that was unhealthy for me. Others decide they want to engage in that way. They will engage, not with trolls, but with with people who might just disagree. And I'm happy to engage with people who disagree, but I'm not happy to engage with hate and refuse to do it. So I think there are strategies, but the biggest strategy is just to have better representation so it becomes normalized. Is it Finland today, where there are a coalition of 5 parties, and they are all headed by women? So to the question in Gro Brundtland's time, can a man ever lead a party or be prime minister? There must be some little boys in Finland asking that question. So I think the more you normalize that kind of representation, and again, it's not just normalizing white women, it's normalizing racialized Indigenous women, women with disabilities, different religions. So I think just having more and better representation is one way that you can tend to reduce the amount of backlash.
It's not just make a woman the leader of her party, also support her and walk her through the entire political system and make sure she succeeds, and that will sort of filter down through the system. And as Andrea said, she's right. Like, no one ever says we tried men and this isn't the time for men, but maybe we can get there. There's a bunch of questions that I want to get to, if that's okay. And Andrea, Leah, feel free to respond to Peggy's comments as well. As I ask these, but something that leads nicely from what Peggy said is, what's the role of men in sort of, achieving critical mass of gender and racialized diversity in the Canadian political system? This has been asked by a few listeners. Leah.
Well, I think it's about giving up place and privilege. When one of the things that I shared with Peggy in the interview in the book is that when I decided to run, when I was asked to run, I decided to do that. I actually had to run against a powerful, established white male. When I told people I was running, they're like, "Oh, that's great," and nobody thought I could do it. But I did. I won my nomination handily. And then I had to take down another male in the election. But I think if we really want to see systems change, that sometimes people need to give up that privilege in place to say, maybe there's a lot of my voice in the House of Commons or on City Council or in the province. Maybe I need to give up my space and place and power for somebody else to run. So I think it's about giving up privilege. We often talk about equality on a number of fronts, but I think the greatest stall to that is that in order to have true equality and equity, people will have to give up some of their privilege to make sure everybody has what they need.
Leah, can I ask you how they do that? Like, how do they actually physically do that?
Well, they withdraw themselves sometimes from running. Like, if for example, if you look at the House of Commons, not only, if you look at the Conservative Party, it's pretty much all white men, like the whole party. But if you look around the House of Commons, there's not a lot of women. And if you look at just Indigenous people in the House of Commons, there's 10 out of the 338. And if you break that down for Indigenous women, it's like, I think 5 with diverse perspectives. Like Andrea said, we come from diverse backgrounds, we have diverse opinions, but there's 5. So why is that? And I think sometimes it's looking around the room and giving up space and place to make sure that the representation is diverse, and that is in all political parties, at all levels, all organizational levels, whether it's the elected officials, party executives, people who hold kind of the decision-making positions in the party. Parties need to say, is there diversity here? Do we have diversity in staffing? Are we electing diverse representatives across the board? And if we're not, then people have to start giving up their place and privilege. I don't think we're there yet. I think we're moving towards that. I've certainly seen examples in my own party, in my own caucus, of people saying, hey, I'm going to step aside because we're not representing. And that's powerful. That's powerful. And it's possible. But we still need that to happen. We still need that to happen.
Yeah, it's almost like maybe the political system should prioritize representation and actually follow through. Andrea.
In a representative democracy, what a crazy concept, right?
Who knew?
Yeah, well, so I can give you a couple maybe practical examples. So if people are listening and they're thinking about how do I action this, maybe this will speak to you a bit. So we did a big update on the women's equity strategy in Vancouver. The first one was done in 2005, very different time than 2018. I think to speak well of it, it exponentially increased expectations of action, which I think was positive, and intersectionality. Anyway, I worked my butt off on this thing. It took me 8 years just to get a majority of council to agree to action it. It was always like, that's important, but the next thing. And so finally there was this window, I won't bore you with the details, but suffice it to say, Overton window opened, and I was like, we're going to shove as much policy as we can through that. So update strategy, we put a mandatory minimum of 50% women on every advisory board, agency, commission, etc. And also did a gender budget audit. So the equity strategy is coming to council, and everyone just assumes I'm going to move it because I've been working my butt off on this thing for 10 years. And at the last minute, really the last minute, I sent a note to the mayor, who was a man. We've only ever had men. I feel like that goes without saying, and said, I really need you to move this. So his response was, oh my God, everyone's going to think I'm stealing this work from you. Like I'm trying to take credit for your work, right? So to Leah's point, like his first thought, and I'm not trying to be critical of him, he's a close friend and the story does end well, but his first thought about how this impacts his own position, right? And I was like, yeah, I get that, but I need you to just swallow that, because people need to see a man leading this. If I speak to it, it'll be me speaking, a couple other women will jump on and it'll just get passed and kind of move along. If it's you, it opens up room. And so what ended up happening, he moved it. Every single councillor spoke to it. The mayor didn't quite cry, but got pretty teary talking about some of the experiences he saw his daughters and former wife deal with. And then the other men started talking about the women in their life. So it created this space that otherwise would never have been there, for quite a catalytic change. Pretty much everyone was in tears by the end of it. So I think if you're on a union, if you're on a board, if you're run an organ, I talked about the power I had in Vancouver. Part of that was, I worked my ass off and was pretty effective at moving things forward. But I also had a ton of people in unions, at nonprofits, in business, who would invite me to come and speak at their events, to give me a stage, to show that it was okay to put a woman on a stage, even a ethnically ambiguous woman who, I never went to university. I had this sort of background that doesn't often get into political leadership. They wanted to show that it's okay, right? So you can kind of normalize this behavior.
Well, it's interesting because you all have sort of described a lot of burden that you're carrying in trying to change the political system inch by inch, which obviously we all appreciate. But I wonder, one argument that comes up time and time again, Peggy, is, if we change the political system, if we have electoral reform, if we get proportional representation or ranked ballots or whatever else, then the problem will be solved almost automatically. Is that true?
No. No, I'm a big fan of mixed proportional representation. I know you just had a whole show on this, plug for the backbench. And but I am a big fan. It is a system that most democracies in the world use, but it's not automatic that system will increase the representation of women. And 30 years or more ago, the UN set a goal of 30% women. So many countries with proportional representation set a goal of 30%, which seemed to then become a ceiling for women's representation. But now we know two things. One, that again, just having women there, if they're not feminists, if they don't really believe in transforming the structures, you're not going to change anything. And also that 30% isn't enough. You need parity, because these structures are so fossilized. I mean, our country, we've had our political system since the formation of the country in 1867, but it precedes that, of course, by many, many years. So this is a structure that was designed to be elitist and hierarchical and exclusive. And I think that broadening it out to proportional representation has, if it's a mixed member, so you keep your local representative, plus, if you vote for the Green Party across the country, you actually, those votes count. And if you're I don't know, God forbid, a federal New Democrat in Northern Alberta, you can actually, have your vote count. If you're a conservative in downtown Toronto, you can have your vote count. So I think those things matter, but PR alone isn't enough. Parties have to change. I already talked about that. And I think, these stereotypes about who is a good leader, who's strong enough to take the top position, for example, as a leader, who's the capable one, who do we want representing us, and not to have to face all those stereotypes, the double bind of being, angry and bitchy if you are firm and tough, or smiley and too feminine and weak if you're too feminine. So, allowing women to be women, and to do the kind of good that I think many of us want to do. And not only women, but I think that women maybe disproportionately understand the importance of social programs because we tend to use them more. But, whether it's Indigenous issues, I mean, I hear Leah in the House speaking up often about missing and murdered Indigenous women, about issues of violence, about First Nations rights. If she's not there, who's going to do that? It should be everyone. But the fact that she's there and makes it a priority, it shouldn't all be on her, but she doesn't let the government off the hook. So I just think PR alone doesn't do it, but we need to beef up the numbers and to have power.
I have to wrap up, but I wonder if I could set like a hypothetical question or a hypothetical future for you all to consider. Looking at the political landscape right now, there is a possibility that in the next federal election, we may have a female leadership candidate, right? Like say Justin Trudeau in this future resigns, Chrystia Freeland, who is the front runner, is nominated to be the Liberal leader. That's a female. Hopefully Ontario NDP might do that in Ontario and have a female, and other provinces will also follow suit and have more female leaders. What do we do to make sure they're not one and done cases? What do we do to make sure that they are the start of a tidal wave of a more representative Canadian political system? Leah, why don't you go first?
Well, I think part of it's outside of ourselves. Like we're talking a lot about things that are external to our power. I'm surviving there because I focus on my internal power. And I think, instead of talking about factors that will always be there to crush us down, we need to maybe have more discussions on things that keep our spirits alive. Like I get up every morning, I was sharing with Peggy, I work out almost every morning. I have a frozen arm right now. I've had it for 5 months, but I'm still running. I'm still trying my best. I get up every morning and I run and I cook. Like things like that just give me joy, so that I have joy. And I think we can speak to the struggles that women have, particularly women with intersectionalities of diverse kinds. But I think maybe we need to speak more about our strength and resiliency and power. I'll give you an example very quickly. When people refer to Indigenous women, they often call us a vulnerable, Indigenous women and other vulnerable populations. So I corrected, politely. I said, when you use the word vulnerable, it's very stigmatizing. I actually think I'm kind of powerful. And they were like, wow, didn't think about that before. And I share that because we are power. We are power because we are in places where we are never should have been, continue to be excluded from, yet we still find ourselves in these places fighting for a better world. And I think we need to focus the discussion on that, because I think that can overtake power. If we use our power to make that the new power and override this colonial power and structure. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be bothering in this dog and pony show. And I feel this way because it's the end of session.
That's a life lesson just for being a woman anywhere, not just politics.
We are power. We are power. And I'm happy to be who I am, where I am, kicking down the walls for other people so that they can just live their power in these places that have tried to exclude us. So I'll just leave it there.
Andrea, very quickly, what would you like to see in this hypothetical future of more female leaders?
Yeah, and I think one and done. I mean, we went through a cycle, Kathleen, Wynne, Chris Clark, like we had a few, right? And then they're gone.
They disappeared.
The family portrait looks pretty homogenous these days across the premiers. I think I've seen it in the comments and the questions. So people get the sense all three of us worked very, very, very hard in public office. So I think if you're asking her, this theoretical future premier or prime minister, to be the one who is able to both do the job, having to do it 3 times better to be there at all, and then also build the enduring movement, that's not going to happen. So she's going to have to work 3 times harder, guarantee you. Like, it's definitely not even twice as hard. It's 3. I had to work 3 times harder than the current mayor just to be a credible councillor, right? Because of the deficits we were bringing into it. So how are you going to help? How are you going to show up? I think Leah's points are so important, right? So like on top of that, do you have ways that you can make, like, I can't tell you how many times people would say to me, oh my God, you're so busy. Do you have 10 minutes for a phone call? And it's like, look, if you understand one, then you must understand the best thing you could do for me is let me go for the run, or like don't make me feel guilty about this time that I need to take to be able to have the energy to be as busy as we are. And I think the last thing we do, and I know this is calling out, but I feel like it's important. One of the folks in the comments referred to Minister Freeland as a Nazi. And I think we have to call that out. If you're going to equate a woman to someone who perpetrated a genocide, why would she run for office? Like, if we don't stand up for her, and I'm not a liberal, that's not my political home at all. But if I don't stand up for her, who is going to stand up for her, right? And I think we have to do that and show up in that way for each other, even when we might be on the other side of issues.
Your comment about, people coming to you and saying, you're so busy, resonates very, very hard right now. Peggy, last word to you. In this hypothetical future of more female leaders, what do we want to see?
Well, I want to start by picking up on Andrea's last point about standing up for each other. I remember being in the House and some guy would make like a dumb comment. He didn't even know how sexist he was being. And I would look across the aisle at Michelle Rempel and she would do this colossal eyeball roll. And it was like usually a member of her own party, although sometimes it was my party. And we would catch each other's eye. And, we would disagree on most issues, but we could still go out for a beer, a glass of wine. We could chat, we could catch each other's eye. And that was really important. And so standing up for other women, I think is important so that it's not just Catherine McKenna, who's dealing with misogynist slurs on her constituency wall, but how powerful it would have been if a multi-party group of MPs, especially women, had come and demonstrated in support of her at her constituency office. So I think just being a bit kinder to each other is important. And I think having that strength of other support. You know, there is an interview in my book with Asma Malik, who is a hijab wearing Muslim woman who faced incredible Islamophobia when she was running for school trustee, and to the point where it was a security threat for her. But the community, not just her campaign team, but the community really rallied around her to denounce that Islamophobia. And I think there's, you know, for all of us, I think there's a responsibility to denounce hate and sexism or racism, any other kind of hate. But just lastly, and talking about, you know, Leah's comments about grounding ourselves, I too would run every morning because it's the only way I could keep sane. I'm a terrible cook though, but what Asma said in her campaigns, and this really struck me and I think is so powerful, is about keeping fun alive. That whatever you're doing in politics is just politics, is not life or death. Let's keep fun alive and enjoy as we go through this, because I can say with experience that you're there for a brief period and then it's someone else's turn, or it should be. So have fun, help others have fun while you're there. And hopefully when we have a woman prime minister, she'll remember to share some laughs.
When we have a woman prime minister again, because there's only been one.
Again, we haven't elected a woman prime minister.
That's true. That's true. When we elect our first one.
Yes.
Thank you to all three of you for this incredible conversation. I learned so much and kind of feel empowered to go smash some ceilings. So that's a good sign. I hope everyone who listened learned a lot and took away a lot of things about how we can all improve the Canadian political system, because it will require all of us to create the culture change that is needed to create a more representative parliament or parliaments across the country. Peggy's book, Women Winning Office. If you think about running or want to run or want to help someone run, it's really, really good. It's a how-to guide. And there are things in there that I didn't even think of when I interview politicians all the time. Have a good evening. You can find all of these women on Twitter. Just be nice to them. Don't send them hate. Otherwise, I will come for you. And be safe, and we'll see you soon.